can have everyone's attention, please. We'll make a quick announcement for the first time. If there's someone who is hearing impaired and needs assistance for hearing the specifics of the meeting this evening, we do have headsets available to assist those that are hearing impaired. We ask that each person that will be making a presentation, if you do have plans or you do have graphs or any information, please place it flat on the table and have it facing this board so we can project and be able to have that part of record as well. And this evening, we're going to ask that if you are going to be speaking to one another, you have to discuss any other matters, please take it in the hallway. It interferes with our opportunity to hear those that are speaking this evening. We're going to start this evening's meeting with first a motion to open. Can I have a motion, please?
I make a motion that we open this meeting of the Board of Architectural Review and Historic Preservation on December 11th, 2017.
Been motioned by Christine. Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Second by Susan. All in favor?
Aye.
Welcome to the December 11th, 2017 meeting of the Architectural Board of Review and Historic Preservation. My name is Curtis Highsmith, and I am your chair. I'd like to introduce our panel for this evening. We have Christina Reddy, Susan Stevenson, along with Jeff Broadleaf. We have our historic consultant, Zach Studenroth, our legal counsel, Bill Robinson, and as always, we always introduce and say thank you to Antoinette and Charlie. We're going to start this evening's meeting with signs and first application. It seems the applicant, which is BP Station, is still requested a letter for...
The letter.
The letter's in file? Do they have it?
The letter's in the file to adjourn until January 8th.
January 8th.
2018.
Okay. So the motion would be that to approve the applicant's request to adjourn until...
I make a motion that we approve the applicant's request for the BP service station to adjourn to our meeting until January 8th.
I second the motion.
The motion was by Christina. It was seconded by Susan. All in favor?
Aye. No, we have to do aye, don't we?
No.
Okay.
Christina?
Next. Aye.
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 Susan?
Aaye.
Jeff? Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Next application, please.
I didn't think it up.
Happy Feet. Sign for Happy Feet.
Is the applicant present?
On Job's Lane.
Happy Feet.
What could that be?
Wonderful place.
I think that's, what do you think? Oh, so we'll figure it out.
Well, if you want to go through the sign itself, it's a pretty simple sign. Looks like a white background, black lettering. It just has the name, looks like J&G Happy Feet. I don't know if doesn't seem to be a proposed lighting or lantern or goose down neck. So the approval would be for just approval of the sign. It was signed off by code enforcement, so therefore fits and complies with code within village. Is there any questions? Jeff?
No.
Any issues?
No
Susan?
problem.
Christine? Is there any public comment on the application? Then the motion would be to approve the application as submitted.
I make a motion that we approve the application for J&G Happy Feet on Job's Lane.
Motion was by Christine. Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Second by Susan. All in favor? Christine?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Jeff?
Aye.
And I'm an aye as well. That concludes our sign permits for this evening. First application, historic. There's a
This application historic is Hampton's HDA, which requests an adjournment until May 2018.
is that a standing adjournment or is that a new request to extend?
I think that one's new. I
Yeah,
just had to look.
Okay. Standing out pretty far, council, should we request the applicant to repost?
Yes, make the motion subject to reposting, remailing, and advertising prior to that meeting. Does it say which meeting, the first or second meeting in May?
No.
Do you have a copy of the letter?
There is a letter, yeah.
It says to read that as the minutes too.
You have to read it.
You want to read it?
First meeting would be the 14th.
You want me to go ahead and read this?
Yes.
Okay. It's dated November 28, 2017, to the Board of Architectural Review and Historic Preservation. Board members, as the architect of record, I would like to request on behalf of Hampton's HDA LLC, 116th North Sea Road,
Be subject to reposting, remailing, and re-advertising of the application.
Make a motion that we approve the applicant's request to Hampton's HBA LLC to postpone adjourn until May 2018 with the provision that they repost, remail, and
Re-advertise,
re-advertise.
and that meeting will be the 14th.
And the next meeting, yes,
Okay,
is
so
the
that motion,
14th.
that motion was by Christina. Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Second by Susan. All in favor? Christina?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Jeff?
Aye.
And I'm an aye as well. Next application, please.
472 First Neck Lane LLC.
Good evening. For the applicant, my name is John Bennett. I'm the lawyer for the applicant, and with me this evening is my associate Bailey Larkin. And also with me is the project architect Lisa Zaloga and our historic consultant Joel Snodgrass. Both Lisa and Joel will be presenting. I have a couple of introductory remarks. We submitted a revised site plan and revised elevations prepared by Lisa Zaloga. These plans were also forwarded to Mr. Fife, Mr. Gifford's lawyer. We submitted these plans in response to comments received from Mr. Studenroth and members of the board at the November 27th, 2017 meeting. The applicant has modified the proposal to incorporate a two-story addition on the north side of the residence with a modest one-story expansion to the north of the proposed two-story addition. Not that these matters are germane to this board's jurisdiction, but I want the board to be aware, nevertheless, that we have kept the bedroom count, which was a sort of a red herring, but nevertheless a issue at the, not a true issue, but a lot of caterwauling about that issue at the Zoning Board of Appeals. Nevertheless, the bedroom count is 9, which is what the Board of Appeals approved. We've also have the same coverage within the regulated zoning wetlands area as was approved by the Zoning Board of Appeals. Indeed, there's a significant coverage reduction outside of the wetlands regulated area. In addition, we're proposing to construct a detached garage. We note that the addition on the north side, or the Gifford side of the residence, will be located 47.5 feet from the northerly property line, where the prior addition was proposed to be located at 41.6 feet. By the way, 35 feet is required pursuant to the village code. I know there's been some talk about historic spacing between buildings. I find no authority whatsoever for that in the code or in any of this board's jurisdiction. However, I think it's important to note that to the extent that the neighbor, particularly to the north, was concerned about historic spacing with additions were made to the Gifford property, and we obtained this, I should say, from the building department. Mr. Gifford used the benefit, and his wife used the benefit of the 4/10 rule, actually becoming closer to the Fox property. So much for concern about historic spacing by the primary opponent. The proposed two-story addition will be 24 feet 11 inches in height, well under the maximum height limitation, and the proposed garage will be 16 feet in height. The proposed two-story addition will not have an accessible roof deck, although it has been shown having a railing for historical accuracy. So this is really a restoration of what was there. The detached garage is proposed to be located in the approximate location of the existing cottage on the property. The applicant is proposing to abandon this pre-existing non-conforming use, which is presently located 34.9 feet from the property. The garage will be shifted south, maintaining a setback of approximately 41.6 feet, and will be a maximum of 16 feet in height.
Lisa Zaloga, I'm the architect for the applicant. I have copies at the last meeting. Curtis, you requested to see some existing conditions drawings, so I wanted to hand those up just so that you have them in the file.
Let's have some for Zach and for Bo if he wants them. I don't want Bo to...
And we're going to discuss that. Is there a way you can actually put that also flat so it can be captured on video?
The existing conditions?
Yeah.
I can.
Be helpful.
Yeah, would you rather just see the picture board?
Okay. You have
It might be easier to understand.
Probably easier. Although I don't want to obscure the... We're just submitting those for completeness of the file. You had asked for existing conditions drawings, so they're the photographs, they're in the file. It's not part of our presentation, unless you had some questions about the existing conditions.
Thank you. Helpful.
Okay. So after our last meeting, we went back to the drawing board based on the unanimous comments of the ARB, where you felt that the addition, the location, the size of the footprint of the addition didn't seem to be working. And so we've now relocated the addition. We've detached the garage. So I'd kind of like to start actually on the last page, the site plan, and just kind of point out a couple of things to you, just so that you can understand.
Okay.
Colored in pretty colors?
Yes.
No, the last page of the proposed drawings, not the existing conditions. So on the site plan, we have this kind of dark, bold, zigzaggy line that runs through our site plan here. That's our 150-foot setback from the wetlands, okay? So that's the reason that there's some hatching, double hatching going on. Primarily what you would want to be concerned with is the two-story addition wing that we're now proposing, located on the north side of the house. It's very reminiscent of the 1920s photo. This is the 1920s photo, this two-story wing that comes off the north side. So what we've done, on that picture, you'll see that the north wing on the east side is actually flush with the east side of the main part of the house. So this wall is one continuous wall. To show our break in our addition, we've actually stepped our two-story wall back. So you can see that horizontal, that orange line that runs around that shows the edge of the two-story addition. It's actually stepped back from the main facade on the east side there by 6 feet. But we've still wrapped the porch around that addition. So if you look at the east facade, you'll see this is the existing part of the house here. This is our two-story wing that comes off. It is very reminiscent of that 1920s picture, but it's stepped back 6 feet from this main facade so that you can still see that break. But we do wrap the porch around it to keep that same horizontal line and break up the mass. Now, as Mr. Bennett mentioned, it's an inaccessible roof deck. It's not going to be able to be got out on. As was mentioned in some previous applications, we were recreating the lattice work on the porch. We are recreating this opening that's on the porch, which you can see in the roof here. The window fenestration will be restored on the main part of the house. The windows will be matching what's there now with that same grille pattern. We will replace the nailed-on shutters with operable shutters to head back to historic views. And we've recreated that window spacing on the addition. We also have that I know you guys had some issues with the kind of modern entry look. So I think that porch softens it, and it brings it back to the porches that wrap around the existing part of the house. So the west facade, you also will still see the two-story addition coming off to the north and the one-story addition. We've created a bay window, again, very reminiscent of the bay windows that are on the south and the east side of the existing residence. And again, the window spacing is very reminiscent of that as well.
Could you address the size? Could you move that, the 1880s off the 1920s? Thank you. That addition seems a lot shorter than what we're seeing here.
Actually, we'll present evidence. The aerial photographs that we have of the area show that this addition is within 3 feet or so of the addition in 19... Well, we'll show you.
I'm looking at a photograph, whether it's in a flyby or a regular photograph.
Oh, no, we'll give you
There's
the
two
actual
windows,
scientific proof.
and it has less of a presence in my head than what I'm seeing on this paper.
I think this is the same.
Yes.
4 windows here.
Yes.
I have 4 windows, but they're paired windows. You can see, there's
Still,
certainly
so-
less wall. I have less wall between
But-
them. So if you look at it, we're within about 3 feet of the length of that building.
We'll demonstrate that to you without Cal.
So then the only other thing that we can discuss is the detached garage. And you also have elevations of that. 16 feet high, very simple design, very similar to pictures that we have of the barns that used to be on the property. Very simplistic, very low key. All the materials will be the same as were discussed the last time. I have that materials board if you'd like to look at it. But white cedar shingles, trim will be painted gray, similar to the picture. What else? As John mentioned, the bedroom count will remain the same. We've actually reduced the footprint by, I think, about 49%. So we've
Reduce the GFA?
Extension?
by-
No,
no, the footprint.
Footprint.
The
The
footprint.
GFA is still 6,000 square feet under the
So
older
you were able
GFA.
to redistribute the total square footage
Absolutely,
into the overall mass of the house, rather than sprawling it.
exactly. As I think we've adequately defined your comments, hopefully.
Just a couple of other things. On the 3rd floor, the dormer on the west facade has been maintained as opposed to that corner dormer that was being proposed.
So that's the recessed dormer?
Quirky thing?
That quirky thing is there. And the dormer on the north facade will stay exactly as it is too.
That's a help.
Any other questions?
No questions? Any questions, Christine?
No. I'm
Susan,
absorbing
questions?
this plan.
No comment.
Jeff, any questions?
No questions as laid out.
Okay, before Joel comes up, a couple of things I wanted to bring to your attention. You see this dotted line that is between the garage and the new proposal. You see this dotted line represents what was the coverage and the massing of the prior addition, which was connected by that connector. So you can see there's significant reduction. I also thought it was interesting. These are some of CMAX drawings, and you can see this was the north addition as shown on CMAX drawings. To be contrasted is this north elevation, which is obviously a world of difference in terms of length, and you can see it both in site plan and both in elevation. So I thought that would be helpful for you to see the great lengths that we've gone to try to come to some was utilized. So this is the building to the north, the objective, the building to the north. And on construction, there had been some testimony that the footprint to the building hadn't been added onto. Indeed, that had been, and also the southerly part of the building did indeed get somewhat closer to this, to the subject property, which would be in this area, by utilization of the 4/10 rule, which means that, as we all know, is a rule that you can use when you have a lot that doesn't conform in width. The proposed, the Fox house has setbacks that are well in conformance, far exceed the minimum setbacks. Okay, Joel?
Good evening, Joel Snodgrass, One View Place, Huntington, New York. My company is Stewart Preservation Services. Oops, wait a minute, let me take two for Zach and Bo. And here's 5.5. Someone asked me, I'm going to put this down and then I'll move it so that it can be, there we go.
Yeah. You can keep it straight, it's fine. He'll find you.
He'll find me, okay, great. I put this together for you basically to elaborate a little further. The last time I spoke to you, I handed out what was a summary of the changes on this building, and it's actually quite difficult to grasp how many changes have occurred over time. I'm really doing this to sort of underscore the morphology of the building over time, and that we're sort of bringing it back now to a specific time period. So if you look at this, on the right in white is where it originally started, and the furthest column, to the left, I'm looking at it upside down, are the various components. And if you follow these across in its simplest form, these are changes that occurred to the roof, and there have been certain things happening. So it's showing basically 4 phases of change, and then at the far right in your category would be what are essentially things that are being attempted to be preserved and so on. But the point I want to get at is, we're picking a time period, and this is, it really needs to be stated, this is not a museum restoration. The times where you restore a building to a specific time period are most often appropriate for, say, a historic period for a house museum or something along those lines. That's actually no longer really espoused in preservation, but what I'm getting at is that the board's recommendation, the general 1920s period is picked. It's actually a nice coincidence because it's when the building was in its full form, if you will, in its largest incarnation. And as a result, it allows these changes to happen and still be historically reflective. I'm actually quite pleased to see that this design has come, as I mentioned the last time, the great benefit of having the ARB input in this is that it helps to shape it and move things in the right direction, and I'm glad to see that that's actually happened. And this has been a very, it's been an intensively ongoing process in the last 2 weeks to try to bring it to the place that was suggested by the board in the last meeting. Not that I want to stay on this, but I wanted to at least give you some ability to have a better idea of a comparison side by side of changes that occur over time, because it really is quite complex and probably represents a greater degree of morphing, if you will, over time than most structures that you come across with this kind of change, particularly because it not only was shortened to begin with, then expanded and was shortened again in certain places. That's quite unique. There was some talk about the fact that there are beliefs that parts of these buildings may actually be close at hand in nearby properties, which is a very, again, I always say I find these things fascinating about these buildings, and that's part of what makes them unique. But it is good to keep this in context so that you can see that where this is coming back to is essentially in the area of greatest change. As we know that there were smaller things that happened, but the most substantive changes really occurred within the 1920s period. I'm now going to hand you this review. 5 more to go out there. in its rawest form. There's basically little or no vegetation. It's wide open. It does show the development of the summer colony at its first stages, and you're looking at the house, and as Zach pointed out the last time correctly, you're looking at the barn that goes with it. I just wanted to make sure that we're seeing this correctly. If you go to the next page, I'm starting to blow in on these and enlarge them so you can see the context of the house and the barn in the background, the two side-by-side buildings in the foreground, and further recessed to the rear. There's some additional close-ups of these to help you out here, but I wanted to make sure that we saw the relationship far away. And now a close-up of the house, again highlighting the hip roof, and also the hip roof one-story appendage to the rear on the west side. The primary farm as we know it today still exists, so the major changes that happened in the first phase were really in this section. And now, as Zach pointed out the last time, here's the barn. And the thing that really is nice about these high-resolution photos is some details come out that you really can't tell otherwise, particularly the doors. As Lisa was referencing, the new garage is trying to reference these things. So, you know, I always try to underscore the fact that, you know, preservation philosophy is looking for an appropriate way to reference historic precedent, not necessarily mimic it, but try to draw reflection upon it in a way that sympathizes, harmonizes, provides a little contrast so that it doesn't fool the learned observer, but blends for the casual observer. And as you look at this, you can see that what's coming out of this is probably a typical 1.5-story facade up to the wall plate, somewhere about there, 1 1/4. It's a fairly high wall. You have sliding doors typically for these barns that go almost all the way up, and when paired together, you have just a simple geometric pattern of 4 panels. You know, in this case, the outline of the trim, which would be typically actually a structural component with just simple vertical boards connected together, has been highlighted, painted, whereas the siding is probably just natural weathered, as are the vertical beadboard, which would be a typical feature for it. Center chimney and so on. But you notice it's a fairly sizable structure. Now, I believe Mr. Foster mentioned the fact that he has had access to a copy of this photograph with handwritten on the back that it was 1882, and I'm absolutely not disputing that. That may be the case. The reason why we had noted this as circa 1890 is because the Brainerd photo was listed as up to 1887. And so trying to, without further evidence, place this, it was reasonable to put it within a close context to that, but also trying to look at the likelihood that it represented a later time period. And that's basically for the fact that you can see that the roof had been altered. There's no chimney in the earlier Brainerd photo here on the back of the building. Oops, sorry, I'll bring it up so you can see it. No chimney on the back of the hip roof at that time. You can now see the chimney peeking through and what looks to be, by sighting, a gable roof. And we've gone over this before, but my premise is that it would be very unlikely that a change like that would occur to the roof line within 2 years of its building. Zach noted in the Sag Harbor corrector that the building seems to be originating about 1880. So it's likely that this is later than 1887, or as per a circa context, it allows it some flexibility when that is. But my premise has been following that due to the dates of the earlier photograph, that it's likely that this is more around 1890, just to put that into context. Now, 1819, this is from a private collection. We're seeing the building now in its first or earliest view that we've had access to of its full-blown incarnation. The long, elongated west wing, the elongated north addition, the full extension of the porch roof going across. The foliage is starting to pick up now, it's starting to grow. The inclusion of the chimney on the north addition, and the earlier chimney still in place, and now the extended roof line with the 4th chimney in place. I should also note there is a very curious appendage at the north side. It's very unclear in this photograph, but as we move to the photograph we all know so well, and it's marvelous to have a view like this. It's in such good and clear detail because you can verify, I mean, you can even see the stains from the copper coming off the roof chimney. You can see much greater detail, including this appendage that I referred to on the north side of the north addition. It appears to be, there's ivy growing on it, it may be a wall, it may be some other thing. If you look, I'll show you the map from 1926, and you can see what appears to be a bump out of some sort. Something clearly is on the north side. It's hard to identify, but certainly there is something extending from the north facade of this two-story addition. Here you can see all 4 chimneys. There's the other one peeking out still again, included. To note here, you can see these are truly operable louvers. Some of them are shut up and down. On an earlier photograph, one is closed. You can't see the window. Here's one that's half open. The windows are still all intact, and some actually in the building appear to be fairly early, but there's a whole range. So the windows of this detail in the house actually represent a range of time. So they were mimicking these windows as they went along and were changing them over time. Some of the roof embellishments, just to jump back 2 pages, were taken off at this time, such as the finials at the peaks were taken away, and so on. So the reason I highlight this is that we're trying to incorporate elements to bring back to this time period for the most part, but trying to also bring back some of what had been removed right at that time period. Now, if you go to the next picture, which is a postcard from the east side, we were fortunate to be able to gain access to views that allow us greater definition and clarity. The other views are from the southeast corner, and so you really don't have any ability to see the north. In this case, you're starting now to see the full width of this original edition, or 1920s edition. And if you go to the next page, here's a blow-up of it. So. But what I wanted to emphasize is, and I just want to make sure that everyone's understanding how large this was at the time. It was substantial. And what we're seeing is just the east facade. We're not actually seeing the west, which was significantly longer. This is the 1926 Sanborn map. And in this view, and actually with your the extra page I just handed to you, you get a much better view of that map, colorized. And you can see, and Zach had pointed this out the last time, that there's nomenclature on the map that explains the height, either 1x, 2x. It explains roof coverings, showing that there are tin roofs on the flat roofs of the addition. And I'm talking about the 8.5 by 11 one, what you're looking at, Christina. So the good news about this is it gives you a fair amount of detail, and you can see the sheer length of this west side addition projecting. And actually, Zach, can I just borrow this for a second for illustration purposes? So if you look at this, you can see how far this grew. It's fairly substantial. But what I really wanted to draw attention to more than anything is the sheer size of what was the barn at that time. It was substantial. It's actually longer than the building with its west addition, and it's as wide as the existing east footprint is right now. But more importantly is you can see there's a two-story appendage which actually projects and it's slightly off-center. It's not a symmetrically centered focal point on the building. It's slightly off-center. That's actually reflected right now in the current garage as a slightly off-center, slightly projecting element. We were trying to play with things that would draw a reference to the fact that something had been there. The other part of this, and you don't need to go back, I'll just draw a reference to it for you, is the barn, as I had mentioned before, the simple four-paneled doors, if you will, two each as sliders. We were trying to draw a reference to that as well and have it stand proud in the off-centered component. So again, trying to speak to it, but in the simplest way possible, but at least making some connection to what had been there. The interesting thing is that the barn, we believe, is still within the site. It's now one of the dwellings that is there, but certainly there's no evidence of any of what had been its earlier exterior cladding or treatments. There literally were none or very few windows in the building. Now it's obviously a residence, so it's been changed and morphed over time, but there's none of the elements that would have been here for us to reference. So we're really going on into the historic photograph and the map information. What I just for a moment wanted to speak to what John Bennett was referring to before by the spacing. I think there was a question about the historic context in which these original buildings would be placed in the landscape and their relationship to one another. And so that the idea was that if there is an intended placement and intended space between these historic structures, that sometimes is true in formalized landscapes. I think it's less the case when you have things that are developed individually over time. So it's one thing to say in a planned community or in a space where you have structures that are built side by side within a very short time period, there's that in particular intention. There was obviously there was a greater time period between Mocamonto and the house to the north. As a matter of fact, in this particular map of 1926, it's not there at all. In another map of 26, you see there is a structure. So there are some variations in terms of map information, but it appears as though these were not built at exactly the same time period. So I don't know if you really can examine those from the same context. The other thing is that the landscape has changed. There's now buffer lines between, and so you don't have the same sight lines in relationships to these structures, other than, say, from the east side of the lake, which is for a moment you may be able to see that, but these buildings really weren't contiguous in terms of their construction, so I don't know if you can really examine that, in that frame of reference. In any case, I think I'll stop and see if there's any questions and go from there.
Any questions? Christine? Any questions?
No.
Susan,
No
any questions?
comment.
Jeff, any comments?
No, not at this point. Is there going to be additional presentation from your side?
No, we thought at this point...
We
thought at this point it'd be best to, obviously, find board's feeling is for an adjournment.
So,
Have something to say?
Check to see if there's any further comments. Zach, a lot of information. I know this is the stuff you love, especially that little timeline there. So you'll be, I'm sure, studying that over the course of the next week or two.
Yeah, of course.
Is there any comment you want to make as to the information that was presented today, or do you want to, as a whole, take time to review things and that way the record's reflected accurately?
Well, sure. I mean, this is going to take a lot of review, but certainly what's being proposed now is within the spirit of the history of the structure itself, which is, I think, 180 degrees from what we have seen before. That's just my initial reaction.
Okay, Curtis, if I may, I mean, it's a request as much as it is a comment. In as much as we'll be looking at this again in January, I think it would be a benefit to the board as well as the public if we could have the sort of full renderings that you did for the previous version, both with the naked eye submitted in a timely fashion, which would mean a couple of weeks before.
Well, it's only a month.
I'll say this.
What's that?
If the applicant can take, if the applicant chooses to submit information the night of the meeting, he or she is only subject to a delay in the process. So it would be obviously in the applicant's best interest to bring it in there a little earlier. However, they run the risk of any time bringing information in that we're unable to either review or comment on, delaying the process for it themselves. We're not doing so. So I just want the applicant or anyone else presenting any information to realize that's the risk of bringing information late. Anything further from council? Jeff, did you have anything further?
No, that was my.
Is there any public comment on the application? Please step forward.
Hi, good evening, members of the board. Good evening, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Studenroth, Patrick Fife, Toomey, Latham, Shea, Kelly, Dubin, and Quadraro, 51 Hill Street, Southampton. I'm here tonight on behalf of the Giffras once again, who are at 452 First Neck to the north, as well as Whitney Stevens, 468 First Neck to the southwest. During the November 27th hearing, the board asked the applicant to go back to the drawing board, which is certainly what's been done here. And I think the request was to substantially revise the plans consistent with the board's comments and also with Mr. Studenroth's report. And I think what was particularly important in Mr. Studenroth's report was the recommendation that the origins of Mocamonto as a circa 1880s summer house home of few pretensions when compared to the great estates that followed in later decades should be considered when designing the scale and placement of the additions. Respectfully, I don't think that's exactly what we have here. The proposed north addition is much larger than the prior northern wing that existed in any iteration of what Mocamonto was, both in 1880 as well as the 1920s. In fact, the addition, the northern wing that they're proposing, they haven't shown you because they haven't shown you an existing house as compared to what the plans are. It's 140% longer than the existing house when viewed from the east elevation. So I don't respectfully think what's been presented here tonight is consistent with what the standards are and what the board had recommended. This information was just shared with us at 3:15 today. We didn't have the opportunity to review everything in detail. I have, for the first time, just seen Mr. Studenroth's analysis here, as well as the photographs, the additional photographs that he went through.
I'm sorry, Mr. Studenroth.
Snodgrass, I'm sorry. I apologize. Studenroth Snodgrass, yes.
What's the difference?
But with respect to...
There's someone over there typing, it makes a difference.
No, it absolutely does make a difference. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, for clarifying that. Yes, no, I had not seen Mr. Snodgrass's information that he had presented. But throughout this process, the ARB, the ZBA, I know the Giffras, the Stevens presented a real willingness to talk to the applicant and try to discuss their concerns and hopefully see that they were incorporated with respect to the plans. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. I know Ms. Giffra, who is here tonight, wanted to make some personal comments with respect to that and some conversations I know that she had with the applicant's team as recently as 2 weeks ago. And we had also written the board and applicant's counsel on December 5th, and it reiterated the willingness to meet with Mr. Fox's architect and designer to discuss the revised plans. Yet we're back here tonight with plans that were just submitted at 3:30. So I do appreciate that the board is willing to give us the opportunity to provide further comments, further input with respect to the plans. But preliminarily, I do have some comments to offer, and I know Mr. Foster, who presented at the last hearing, the last two hearings, is also here, and he has some brief comments to present as well. But I still don't believe the plans conform with the village's standards or the Secretary of the Interior standards. I think this is still not an addition that alters the historic structure as little as possible. It's not minimal in mass and scale, as Mr. Broadleib said. He felt additions should be with respect to historic structures during the last hearing. And I don't think it's subservient. that exactly. But if you look at their own plans here, they take it from this direction, and it's hard to zoom in, but the current house, which is from here, they conveniently put a lot of patio furniture or something on the porch to make it look like...
Please, no. You'll have time for rebuttal. We're not, John, let's start this now. Please
But with
continue.
respect to the structure itself, from here to here is 40 feet. The proposed two-story addition is 37 feet, and there's an additional guest feet that's 27 feet. So if you look here, and I just did this quickly in my office before I came over here, this red line essentially represents the existing house. This yellow line represents the length of the proposed addition. Certainly a lack of balance, tipping the scales here. This is not subservient to the existing structure by any means. And in addition, I don't believe it is consistent with the earlier versions of Mocamonto. I know Ms. Zaloga said that it was very reminiscent of earlier versions. I think if you just count, again, the number of window bays, when you look at the earlier versions, this was the 1880s photo, which appears to show one, possibly a second bay hidden behind. The 1920s photo shows the two window bays. Clearly, you count here 1, 2, 3, 4, plus a one-story addition, which again is another 20 feet in width. It's substantially longer than any prior northern wing on the house. In fact, it's the original, I think Mr. Foster will speak to this a bit, but the original, and I tried to draw it here, and I apologize for kind of having crude drawings in preparation for tonight, but if you look at this line right here, this represents really where the existing house ended. And you see the size of this. It's about 50 to 60% of the original structure. This was the original north addition that existed on Mocamonto.
Does that photo represent or representative of the pinnacle or the largest portion of the additions of the
I
house?
believe it is with respect to the northern wing. This does represent the largest iteration of that northern wing.
You're saying is that they're taking in consideration that extension and they're adding to it and filling the
Correct.
size.
They're essentially tripling the size of that. I think Mr. Foster's going to explain that this was approximately 20 feet in width, and what they're proposing now between the one-story and two-story is 60 feet in width. It's a substantial, I'm sorry, John. It's a substantial change from what previously existed, and certainly it's a substantial addition in comparison to the existing structure that's there today. I also do not think that the proposed addition accounts for the fact that Mocamonto was once only the only house on a much larger property. I do think spatial relationships not only matter, but the consideration of spatial relationships is required by the village code as well as the Department of Interior standards. I mean, the criteria with respect to the village's standards, any alteration of an existing feature of property shall be compatible with its historic character as well as with the character of nearby properties. New construction shall be compatible with the character of nearby properties in the historic district. And further, the Department of Interior Standard 9 specifically talks about spatial relationships. New additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. The new work will be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with the historic materials, features, size, scale, and proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property and its environment. The subject property is non-conforming. It's located within the R120 zone, and it's now just over 2 acres. Much of that consists of the driveway area, the shared driveway area that goes up First Neck Lane. Over time, this property was owned at once by the Betts family, and it was subdivided into 4 separate properties sharing a common driveway. And in fact, I think as recently as 1988, the Jiffers property and the applicant's property were under common ownership. The Frisk property, which was the stables, which I think is where the barn structure It's located along the same northern boundary. So, and I think as we've previously noted before the board in written submissions, and I think at the first hearing as well, that pool house burned down in 2014. The applicant reconstructed it without seeking any approval from this board, as we believe was required by the village code. There was no application for a certificate of appropriateness.
It was rebuilt like in kind from there were no changes in design or details or anything?
Correct, but 65.4 of the village code expressly provides without any exception, certificate of appropriateness is required for any reconstruction of a structure within the historic district. There's no exception.
So just so I understand what you're asking this board with regards to the accessory structure, are you saying that that's something this board should have had the opportunity to review? Have you mentioned that to the building department?
We've mentioned it before with respect to the ZBA. I know that was, I'll say, in a sense, left open as a matter, I think, to be addressed by this board if it felt it was necessary.
That's an absolute misrepresentation.
John, you'll have opportunity to rebut any information that's been spoken today or this evening.
But more importantly, my point of bringing up the pool house and the surrounding properties is because I think it would be inconsistent with the historic nature of this property to allow the pool house to remain, allow a second accessory structure in the garage, and then also permit the expansion of the main house to something that never existed before. Again, in terms of the proposed addition to the north, we're talking about a proposal that would expand it to 3 times the size of what that northern wing had ever been.
Okay, so I understand this. The pool house is not before this board with regards to any review or any opportunity.
There's no application.
There's no application. It's not mentioned in the application itself. Therefore, what you're asking for a administrative response or reaction to what you consider to be a violation. We're not an administrative board to do so.
Understood.
So that would be a building department where you would have to advise that you feel that requires some type of further review.
Okay, understood with respect to that issue. I do think it's something that the board would have jurisdiction over, but separate and apart from that, I think it's very important for the board to take into account the existence of the pool house in connection with its review of the density on this property, the spatial relationship of the buildings on the property, and the request to expand this property to, again, what we believe is well beyond what had historically existed. Because that pool house was not part of the original property. It was put there in 1989. It's not part of the history, but so I think when you add all of those things together, it's something that needs to be taken into account because it does go to the density, it does go to the spacing on the property. So for the applicant to, again, come here and ask for an expansion to the north that is far larger than any expansion had ever existed, I think you also have to take into account what the applicant already has. And that does include an accessory structure that already exists, and it's a quite sizable one in almost 900 square feet that has 2 additional bathrooms. So I think in sum, the application in this present form still seeks to create much more density than had ever existed before on a much smaller property than had historically existed. So I do think that the board does need to take that into account. And once again, I think the model that the board should follow is the origins of Mocamonto as the 1880 summer home of few pretensions. I don't think that this request or this current application, I'll call it, or these current plans meet that standard. Just finally, I had one other point with respect to the request about the wetland setback. I do note that, at least as shown on the plans, it doesn't appear there's any further encroachment into the wetlands. However, we have not seen any. I know there was also a representation that there's only going to be 9 bedrooms. There haven't been any floor plans that have been presented with respect to this, and I think that's something that would be relevant potentially to the zoning board's consideration with respect to an analysis of the environmental impacts as well as potentially the off-street parking issues. I realize that's not an issue for this board per se to look at, But as we've noted before, we were urging a coordinated review. So to the extent there is any need to go back to the Zoning Board of Appeals, we would once again urge, as the Department of State's recommended, that there be some kind of coordinated review with respect to this application. For the first time either earlier today or tonight. I would just ask to have the opportunity to come back at the next hearing and provide a further and more detailed response with respect to the issues the applicant raised.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment? Please step forward.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Foster. I was here before. The Jiffers and Sabins have retained me to provide an independent historical architectural review of their neighbor's application to expand Mocomanto. I've only had the opportunity this afternoon to quickly review this, but I have a couple comments that seem to jump off the page for me. It's clear that the sizing and massing of the new proposed addition are not really historically appropriate for this building, which is a historically significant building for Southampton. And that's really what we're talking about, the historic significance of this building and how to maintain that. The new plans are also not consistent with the Department of Interior standards. This is just a page, I believe this was handed to the board a month ago or something like that. So it's part of your package. It talks about the rear additions and how to historic houses and how size overwhelming the original gem part of the house can be, even if it's detailed exactly the same way, can overwhelm the historic quality of the house. In comparing the scaling of the 20s photos and the maps of Mocomanto that were given out, presented at earlier meetings, with the proposed new addition, the north addition in the 1920s went out approximately 20 feet. That is approximately 1/2 of what the existing east facade is. That is the same plan here we got. I colored this in or darkened it in a little bit. This is the porch that wraps around. That's not counted. So this is 40 feet. This is 30 feet. From that spot to this spot is 30 feet, 40 feet, and this is half of 40 or 20 feet. That goes right to there. This plan here is one of the larger plans that we have. You can see that from this spot to that spot is the 40 feet. This to there is 30 feet. This is the little addition on the back where the entry is. This is 20 feet. It's very clear with proportional dividers that this is 1/2 of this and this is 2/3 or 3/4 of that. So even on these primitive drawings, each of them are consistent over like every 10 years. I looked at each one, they all came out the same in that particular regard. I believe that the original gondola photograph is early from 1882, like it was written on the photograph, and it's completely consistent in my mind with the house starting out that way with a 20-foot guest wing and the extended staff wing in the back, growing through the 1890s, through the 1920s, and then at Depression time, everything went away. The idea, the original owner, and the inspiration behind the building lived in there until 1929, or 26, one of the two. Sorry, I can't remember. But 50 years. So we have somebody that's totally in charge, knows what she wanted, knew that she could build these sort of wings that go off and just throw them away. They're not really part of the house because they're tiny extension to it. And so it was natural for her to enlarge and diminish as her needs were. You know, the bigger the house, the more staff you need. If you don't need staff, you just smaller. Also, you can see in the photographs that we saw today that chimneys went up and chimneys went down. They're easy to build. If they had a chimney in 1882, they could easily have taken it down, expanded it. That was the kitchen chimney from the kitchen wing, and that, you know, they probably got a bigger kitchen. Therefore, okay, this new two-story wing goes out almost 40 feet, not the 20 feet, plus the additional awkward Howard Johnson one-story guest bedroom suite, which goes out an additional 20 feet, making a 60-foot addition.
Did you just call it a Howard Johnson?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
That's not even.
Therefore, look at it.
Funny.
Therefore,
Quick question, just a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
Because you make reference to the linear portion of the house that is, again, Pinnacle. What is your estimate of the elongated extension along with the annex towards the rear? What would you say is your largest portion, or what was the length of that in total?
Now, there's north and there is west.
Yes.
North, I believe the original house had 10 feet and they added another 10-foot bay to it. See, they're bays. Each window has sort of a 10-foot zone for it. So across the 40-foot, there's 4 zones.
Correct.
And then they boom, another bay, another bay. So it was sort of normal to build in 10-foot bays for them. And then it's hard to tell in that sort of northwest area what actually was in that corner, but at some point it was like a little courtyard, you know, a little L-shaped spot, and they may have gone further into it, but they didn't go further than the 30 feet, you know. As far as the west wing, it's probably maxed out in that one photograph taken from the beach. That's pretty long. I didn't scale that out.
Okay.
But it, you know, that we're not talking about that wing anyway. But that was pretty large.
I only asked that because that's the portion of the additions that the applicant's proposing, and we're trying to get a reflection of.
No, the proportion they're going to the north.
Okay.
There's a small addition they want on the west side, which I can comment on, but I think that next time is a better time to comment on it because there's a lot of, fundamentally, it's what are the meets and bounds of this thing and then how to get it to work, right? It can't just go on like a amoeba.
I only asked that because there's been a lot of reference to how long, what percentage increase, but there hasn't been anything demonstrated to determine that those are accurate numbers. And we're trying to build, we're trying to build a record, I want to make sure that we have
From the maps that we get, the Sanborn type maps I'm talking about that come out every decade, and from these photographs, you can see in this photograph, it's really an illusion. It's amazing how long the building looks, but actually, this roof, you see, this is sloped, where is it? This, I'm looking at it upside down, I can't see it right. This is the sloped roof, this is the same slope roof on the other side right there. It comes down to this spot, and then, of course, there's the large overhang, it comes to here. So this is the original house, plus this. I mean, the original, the 30 by 40 cube is what I'm talking about. I didn't mean the original. The original 30 by 40 cube, and that's the addition. So that's the extent of max going to the north on all of these maps, which is like...
Yeah, so we look at the photo, you see it looks like that they're they're pairing the windows. The windows are closer to the original rather than where there's a substantial amount of spacing between the two. So I'm trying to say in relationship to what's being proposed and what's being demonstrated there in that photo, can you,
well,
estimate?
If you pretend you can twist this 10 degrees so that this flat, like elevations kind of lie because you don't see them in perspective in a certain way. But you see this proportion is this, my two fingers coming right to that. And then I do my two fingers again from this spot.
Oh, come on.
That's okay.
It comes down.
It's not scientific, but
not at all.
So,
but
but that's what I'm getting at. We're looking at photos. We're looking at graphs. We're looking at elevations. It's hard for you to.
If I can interject, I think it may shorten things. I have a 1930 aerial overhead.
You allowed to talk?
Yes, I'm just trying to shorten things. I have a 1930 aerial over. We'll provide an aerial photographic analysis. We're going to give you the length of that.
When we get to a point of rebuttal, John, I know it's difficult. Can you just
Thank you. Yeah.
Any other public comment? Please step forward.
Good evening again. My name is Joyce Jafra. I'm here to represent my husband Bob and our 3 children, Elizabeth, Caroline, and Robert. As you know, we live next door at 452 First Neck Lane, right next to Ken Fox. Like Ken's home, our house was originally owned by the Betts family, one of the leading families of Southampton. I just wanted to take a moment of your time to provide some perspective of our experience in this process. During this board's November 27th hearing, the board advised Mr. Fox that his team should substantially revise its plans and take into account the board's comments and the report of the village historical preservation consultant, Zach Studenroth. Since last February, we've repeatedly asked Ken to please scale back his plans for an addition to something reasonable. We have no interest, as we've indicated before, in a public fight with our neighbor. On the last night of the last ARB hearing on November 27th, my husband and I saw several members of Ken's team at a restaurant across the street, including Lisa Zaloga, his architect, and Joel Snodgrass, his historical consultant. After exchanging some pleasantries, we reiterated again that we wanted to work with Ken and his team on a plan for an addition that would be reasonable. After we spoke, Mrs. Zaloga promised that she would speak to Ken Fox about our willingness to work with him. Since the last hearing, no one from Ken's team has reached out to us, or our lawyer, or our other neighbor, Whitney Stevens, who also drove out all the way from the city to be here tonight like myself. On December 5th, our lawyer wrote to this board and to Ken's lawyer requesting that we meet and share any revised plans with us and the Stevens before any revised plans were submitted to this board. Instead, rather than having 10 days to review these revised plans, we just received these revised plans at 4 o'clock this afternoon, which seems to be a track record about how Mr. Bennett has performed before this board. Since last spring, there have been no discussions between our family and Mr. Stevens on one hand and Mr. Fox or his architect and designer on the other. As the chair recognized at the November 27th hearing, this is a very important application and it should not be rushed through the board. In evaluating any proposal to expand Moco-Monto, even based on some version of the most historic structure during its more than 130-year history, the board should take into account that Moco-Monto was once the only house on a much larger property of 8 acres or more. This seems to be lost in the discussion here tonight. Over time, the original property was subdivided at least into 4 separate parcels, all sharing a common driveway. We believe that part of Moco-Monto, perhaps in the 1920s or earlier, was moved to the location of our house and is now incorporated into the southern portion of our house. In fact, as recently as 1988, our property and Ken's property were under common ownership. The Stevens property was once part of the Moco-Monto property, and the 4th house in our neighborhood, which is owned by Tommy and Julie Frist, was once the stables and the outbuilding for Moco-Monto. In evaluating any addition, this board must take into account the impact on our historic neighborhood and the current spatial relationship of all the houses within the neighborhood, including that at least 2 of the houses did not exist during the early 1880s when Moco-Monto was built. As Mr. Studenroth wrote in his report, and I quote, try to build a massive house like our neighbor is proposing. Our house has 7 bedrooms, we have 3 children, and a large extended family. In evaluating Ken's plans, as I begged you the last time, please put yourself in our family's position. What would you do if your neighbor next door wanted to double the size of a historic house? When Ken Fox bought Moco-Monto, he knew it was in the historic district, that he was buying a jewel of the village, and it was entirely within the wetlands setback. Right now, Moco-Monto has nearly 7,000 square feet of living space with a separate guest house and a separate pool house. As the Southampton Press said in its August editorial, which was titled A Simple Choice, quote, "The Foxes purchased a historic home, not a building lot. With it comes some degree of responsibility for the past, as well as the present and the future, instead of another massive overbuild, and it should be celebrated for what it is, a perfectly lovely home." End of quote. The board should take into account all of the public opposition to Ken's plans, including groups such as the Southampton Association, the Peconic Baykeeper, the Group for the East End, and the Agawam Conservation Association. And to date, as of last week, more than 1,240 people have now signed the online petition objecting to these plans. And I really ask you to carefully consider all of this public support in opposition to this proposal. These include a lot of the people who live on Lake Agawam. This application is much more than about Moco-Monto or our family. It's about the future of the lake and the village. If the board approves these plans, there will be no limits for what can be done to a historic house in this historic village. With Lake Agawam unsafe, I'm dismayed that the zoning board, by a contested vote, approved the proposed glass connector and the board should not set a second precedent allowing for a massive overdevelopment around Lake Agawam. We once again urge you to say no to these unprecedented plans. Thank you.
Any more public comment?
Got one of us, but I promise I'll be nice and quick.
Oh, okay. Do you need assistance?
Nope, I'm good, thanks. I don't even have any notes at all, so you're going to get a little bit of iPhone action.
You know, you can actually stand right here in the front of the board here, and we'll be able to pick up.
I'm becoming an expert at this,
Okay.
actually. So here we go. So first off, number one, I just want to say,
Your name for the record.
oh, I'm sorry, this is Whitney Stevens. We live at 468 First Neck Lane. We are the neighbors immediately to the west. I think, Patrick, you said the southwest, so I'm never that strong directionally, but we're basically to the west and a little bit to the south. And I believe, if I were to take a guess at it, we're probably that west wing that got moved over in one of the many pictures, but I am not going to actually go there. I know none of us have really had a chance to review these plans at all, but there's two things I'd like to say about them. The very first is they're heading in the right direction. From our standpoint, when we look at this, we feel like this is something, as a family, we could work with the Foxes to get to where it could really work. Historically, when we've looked at the plans before, it was extremely difficult to understand how do you get from where we needed to be in terms of the scale and the size and the massing of it to where Ken clearly was, or Mr. Fox clearly was. This time, we feel like there's some runway for all of us to work on. So once again, as a family, we're going to come back and say, we really would ask that we have a sit down together and really go through the plans, and that some discussions take place between the Stevenses and the Ziffras and the Fox. And I know Mr. wing going to the north is basically, so it's a south facade, it's going to the north, is more than 2 times the width of the original Mocomanto. So basically, it's another length of Mocomanto, and so you're basically widening Mocomanto 2 times at least. My question about that is whether or not that really is a subservient expansion to the building or not. So that's question number 1 I would ask. The second question I would ask is really about the impact, the historic stature of this house overall. Mocomanto, we've discussed it time and time again, has a very special place in the hearts of everybody that cares about Southampton. And so I would ask, as you think about this, because this is ultimately an irrevocable decision, that you really think about, is this the best that can be done while you're meeting Mr. Fox's needs to actually, he needs expansion needs. He needs a family room. He needs certain things. He needs to modernize the home. He needs a 2-car garage. But is this plan really the best that can be done for Mocomanto in respecting it to the furthest point, to the best point possible that still meets Mr. Fox's needs, but at the same time, from our standpoint, respects the home and its place both in the village of Southampton and in all of our hearts. So that's what I would ask. And that is about it from our end.
Just to respond to the meeting, and it's been said a few times, this board makes suggestions and recommendations to people that the applicants in the community
just
make.
keep us working, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, but we can't enforce it. We only recommend it because it helps out, at least having dialogue and discussion. But
I know you're not going to enforce it, but what I would ask as you look at this and going forward, encourage us in this room right now that really care about this to get to the right place at the end of this process. Because I can tell you, I know all of us invested a lot of time and a lot of energy to getting to the right place. Tonight we made our first step, and I'd ask and say that we have some more work to do. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there any more public comment? Is there rebuttal from council?
No, don't worry about it.
Thank you very much. We will demonstrate the length of the northerly wing by aerial photography analysis. It's substantially larger than has been represented to you by Mr. Fife and Mr. Foster. We do have a 1930 dead-over aerial which shows that that northerly wing is within 3 to 4 feet of this proposed addition. It's not a shot that's from the side or has any distortion. It's an above shot, and we'll get that to you. So we'll have that, and we'll have it analyzed by a qualified person regarding aerial photography. But I do have to remind you, when it comes to dimensional setbacks regulation and dimensional regulations generally, all of the stuff that you've heard about spatial relations and other things are simply made out of whole cloth. So, but anyway, we'll respond in writing. By the way, the existing house is 5,000 square feet. The existing Fox residence is 5,000 square feet. The Jiffa residence is over 8,000 square feet. It was added on to. Ms. Jiffa keeps on saying she didn't increase the square footage of the property, or she didn't increase the footprint of the property, but these are from the building department, so you can see yourself, and also the setback was increased. I'm just responding, that's all. I don't, just responding.
You know that application's not before us.
No,
I know
it's
you're
not
trying to
before
show
you.
it in terms of
No.
relation. In terms of relation, I get that, but I don't want to go to depth.
That's all,
over
that's the beginning of the end, beginning and end of it, okay. And by the way, I have to chuckle when I hear this was somebody referred to this. I'll say this once, and someone referred to this as the Betts ancestral home, as if it was Marlborough's Blenheim Palace or something like that. This was a boarding house. It happened to have been built by the Betts family. Be that as it may. Let me just very quickly, and then we'll respond to all this in writing, and we will provide the information that Mr. Broadleaf asked for. The pool house doesn't have any bedrooms in it. The pool house is beyond attack. The under coverage, though. Well under coverage.
Understood. I'm just
well under
trying
coverage.
to best
No.
I can
There was an argument that the pool house was rebuilt without an appropriate certificate of appropriateness.
And that was responded to with regards to authority, and this board has none. We asked for the building department.
So I would request that you adjourn the matter to your next hearing, which I think is sometime in January, and we will provide the information that Mr. Broadley requested.
A lot of the information was said this evening. Zach, you have not said or made any comment this evening, and I would imagine you would need time to review everything before making final comment.
Looking forward to it.
For the record?
Yes, I will.
All right, and in doing so, the applicant has asked that these application be adjourned until the first meeting in January. Board members, Jeff, do you have any questions or comments until then?
Said my piece.
Susan?
None.
Christine?
No.
Okay, and I have no comment either. Therefore,
I would want people to read all this information that we're
we would
including the letter.
We would definitely request that anyone who has interest in this application and therefore also questions as to what has been provided this evening, go to the building department and look at all of the information and take the time to really analyze it, and also prepare for any rebuttals that you may have at the next meeting. Okay, so there are letters of objection in the file. Looks like there were emails that were sent to the building department. Today. So that also is in the file. It has not requested, and I did not see anything that requests that it be read into the record. So therefore, it's part of the record. No reference that it be read into the record.
And then I would just like to ask that Diane made a request that give me back the stuff so I can put it in anything you're not taking with you, so I can put it back in the file, because she said there was so much stuff left on this desk.
Oh, I know. Sorry.
Housekeeping. Okay.
I have done that. I've put a pile of stuff.
That's housekeeping stuff. We'll deal with that after the meeting, please.
Never mind.
So, therefore, the applicants request that this be adjourned until our next, our January meeting. The motion would be to approve applicant's request to adjourn.
I make a motion that we approve the applicant's request to adjourn to our next meeting, which is on January 11th. January 8th.
Motion by Christine. Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Second by Susan. All in favor. Christina?
Aye.
Susan?
Aye.
Jeff?
Aye.
And I am an aye as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure people are moving in and out, so let's give a couple of seconds while people shift.
We have more than,
Can we have
3 minutes?
a 3-minute break?